All right, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on Total Home Electrification. So what we're going to be talking about is a couple of subjects, but most importantly, how to transition your entire home to effectively running off of solar. So what this means is eliminating your electricity and your heating costs, as well as if you're considering switching from a gas vehicle to an electric vehicle, how that can benefit you, and how to use batteries both for backup and for peak shaving or arbitrage, as it's called. Now, some of you here today will have attended my webinar from last week. We dive into a little bit more detail on the benefits of net metering versus behind the meter. In case you weren't able to make it, no worries. We did post it on YouTube, and I am also going to briefly talk over some of the same subjects at some point here today for those of you who weren't able to make it. Okay. So basically what we'll be doing is comparing the cost of hydro, heating from various sources, whether it's electricity, such as a furnace, baseboard, that sort of thing, or fossil fuels, like gas, propane, oil, these sorts of things, and how that would compare against heating your house with solar through electricity and heat pumps. And also, by looking at all of these individual variables, we'll bring it all together to look at how it looks as a whole solution. The important thing to recognize here too is that whether you only go with just solar or you decide to go with everything, if you choose to make the leap, any amount of it helps. So a little more detail here. So we're going to start with talking about solar, of course, and how it can help with your existing electricity bills. Of course, some of you have future plans, some of you want hot tubs. I mean, who doesn't, and other things like extensions and these sorts of things. So we'll talk about how scalable the systems are as well, in case you have future plans. We'll also talk about switching, as I said, from fossil fuels to heat pumps. When scaling the system for the solar, we would just add on a little bit to make it able to handle the heat pumps too. Now, interestingly, with switching from electricity to heat pumps, it's a little bit different. A lot of you may or may not know this, but standard electric heat compared to heat pumps are approximately 300% the efficiency. So for those of you that are heating with electricity, you probably notice you have very high power bills. But when it comes to solar and getting heat pumps, you can actually get away with a smaller system and actually offset the heat pump for far less usage than with your electric. So we'll look at the cost for that across Canada too. Many people right now are also making the consideration of, do I want to stick with my gas vehicle? Do I want to go hybrid? Do I want to go electric? So we'll talk about how gas costs look across Canada and what the perks to switching for an electric vehicle might look like for you. And lastly, as kind of foreshadowed earlier, talking about batteries and how that integrates and brings everything together. So starting with solar. With solar, you kind of have four main areas you can go. There's partial offset and full offset without a battery, and then partial offset and pretty close to full offset with a battery. Now, each of these four scenarios has a different group of people that they're really directed at, and some different goals that are achieved. For some people, you may just be looking for an introduction to solar to see if it benefits you. Start off with a small system. In many cases, this is where people go with partial offset net metering. And what that means is that you're eliminating some of your bill, you still have a little bit left, but the portion that's offset is covered by the solar. Now, when it comes to net metering, what we're referring to as a refresher is the concept of using credits to pay your bill. So for example, as we probably, some of us know here and some of us don't, a lot of the provinces in Canada have something called net metering. So you produce extra power in the summertime, and then of course less in the winter, just because of how the seasons work. During that summertime, that extra credit is being sent back to your power company, and it's usually 1-to-1. Each province has its own kind of criteria and stipulations for it, but using those credits, we then pay our bills during the winter and at nighttime when there's little to no sun. So partial offset net metering then is using that system to offset at least some of the bill, if not most. Full offset, on the other hand, we're scaling the system big enough that while you're not going to be giving any free power to the government and doing them any favors, you will be producing enough extra credits during the summertime to take care of your entire winter bill. This is where I would say probably about 50% of our clients are. Okay. Next, we have partial offset behind the meter. And so that's the concept of using the batteries, which some of you who had attended the last one might recognize this term as well. The idea here is you can use the batteries for, of course, as many of you know, backup, but more importantly, to actually save you money on when you buy your power. A lot of provinces now have something called time of use, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. But by gamifying this time of use program, as is called peak arbitrage, we can actually buy this power back cheaper overnight. So what'll happen then is you charge that battery at night and discharge it during the daytime when your power costs are higher. And we'll look at some numbers as well to kind of put a visual behind that shortly. And lastly, full offset behind the meter. So what this means is that we're offsetting as much of your bill as possible and as is responsible given the grants, and then making up the difference with the battery. So what that would look like for many people is offsetting 70 to 80% of their bill with just the solar panels, and then having something, say, like a Tesla Powerwall, to buy that remaining 20 to 30% at that discounted overnight rate, which varies by province, but we can talk briefly about that a little bit later on too. So we're going to look in a little more detail about these two different options. So with net metering, we already talked about how it's a one-to-one credit system in most provinces. So whatever you send them, you usually get back. There are some caveats to that, but for the most part, it is one-to-one. The other thing that's nice about it, though, is that for people who don't have grants for things like batteries, it eliminates the need to have one as far as offsetting your bill in the winter and at nighttime. Of course, as I'm sure you can appreciate, we're not really getting anything out of the solar panels when it's 2 in the morning. So that's where the credits come in, and that allows the grid to, in effect, kind of be like your battery. Now, of course, the only shortcoming there is that if you lose power, you don't have that backup. Not everybody needs it. Some people like to have it, and for some of the scenarios we talked about, some people may actually opt to use the battery to eliminate their reliance on the grid during the daytime just because it saves them money. There's a bunch of grants and stuff that some of you know, but we'll talk about those a little bit briefly later on too. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what happens at different points during the day and the year as far as net metering goes. So, as some of you will recall, there's kind of 4 main times of the day that we're concerned with. Midnight to sunrise. Of course, it's dark and approaching sunrise. Sunrise to midday, so that mid-morning to early afternoon. Midday to sunset, which is where a lot of us are getting most of our production. And sunset to midnight. So, midnight into sunrise, you're approaching sun coming up. You've got some credits, you're using those to power your house, or maybe you've got a battery and you're powering your house with that. As soon as sunrise comes around, we're starting to get some production on those panels right away. And as the day goes on, it only gets higher and higher. Then, once we move into midday, we're getting some pretty substantial overproduction happening. That overproduction, that's where those credits come from. So you can think for summertime, for example, this is usually about 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Okay. From about 5 p.m. onwards, as we're approaching sunset, it's starting to die off again. And then, of course, leading into the night, not really a whole lot of production, going back to relying on those credits or that battery. Now, zooming out a little bit, looking at the year, winter, as I'm sure you can appreciate, will have less production than, let's say, the summertime. Right? So you're going to see that you're producing about 2 or 3 times as much in the summer as you are in the winter. Same logic applies, though. You'll be relying on 100% solar with a full offset system in the summertime, but in the winter, you'll have some production, and the credits will make up the difference. If, on the other hand, you're dealing with something more like with a battery, you might opt to buy that extra power back at a cheaper rate if you don't have enough solar to offset your bill. In the audience here, I'm sure we've got quite a spread. But I've seen bills here where people are paying anything from $100 a month to $800 a month for just their electricity. And some of you are probably pretty surprised by that, but I guarantee if you go down the street and ask your neighbors, you'll be in for quite a shock. Power has never increased faster than it is right now. So, that said, I want to show you guys an example of actually what to expect with the different times of the year. Here, I'll switch tabs here. Okay, so take a look at this. This is a majority offset system with a battery. Okay. As you'll see, we're at 89% offset. This is no mistake. With a battery, because of the grants that are available in some places, you will opt to get a smaller system than 100% offset just to incentivize getting the battery and then use the grants to pay for the majority of it. So this is a good demonstration of what we're looking at from season to season. As you can see then, we've got a few months of the year where there's overproduction. In this case, we're looking at anywhere from, for this person, June until September, then a little bit in the fall too. And most of you, it's going to actually be March until about July, but everybody's going to look different. So this gray wave represents this person's usage, and these black bars represent their production. So during the parts where the black bars are past the gray wave, that's where we're saving up the credits for the winter and the nighttime. And where they're below the gray wave, that's where we're relying on those credits. Or in the case of this battery system, that's when we're buying back the power at that cheap rate overnight. Yeah. Let's switch back here. So let's talk a bit about the heating costs. We're going to start with fossil fuels because at least 60% of the country is on fossil fuel-based heating. Varies by province. Of course, here out on the East Coast, we've got some people that are 90% of the time using oil, sometimes have wood backup, sometimes have baseboard backup. Newer homes, sometimes are still being built with natural gas, but for a lot of the central country, we're relying primarily on natural gas. And then, of course, for the western provinces, oftentimes it's propane. So let's take a look then at what that looks like across the year. So I have it divided by heating type. We look by province. What we see is that heating with oil is typically by far the most expensive. But unfortunately, this represents a pretty big portion of the country, as you can see, that are heating by oil. $2,872 a month on average, or a year, sorry, $239 a month. Even with natural gas, $500 a year, $41 a month. This may not seem like a lot until we consider just how much gas has changed in the last 10, 15, 20 years. I personally remember being in school and at one point it being 70, 80 cents, right? This is what it's going to look like going forward. It's going to keep increasing like this. And the point of it all is that it's still above zero. We can do better, whether it's $500 or $3,000 a year. So encourage you to take a look at this and kind of see yourself based on the province you're in and how you're heating and what this means for your financial picture. Sure, we could all agree we could use an extra $100 to $200 in our pocket each month. So let's talk about what the perks are aside from the money side of it. We already know, based on those tables there, that the average Canadian saves about $1,406 a month. But more importantly, in some cases, there are grants that can pay for most, if not all, of this heat pump. And on average, a typical home uses a 3-ton heat pump or 36,000 BTUs. We decide the sizing on that for you, so that's not something you ever have to come to us and be expected to know. It's something we help with. But with that average size heat pump system, we're seeing people getting grants of $9,000 to $12,000 sometimes, which takes care of the majority of the price. So effectively, getting rid of a lot of that heating cost for next to nothing. Now, of course, aside from that, a lot of us here are concerned about the environmental effects. Some of you may know this, some of you may not, but the federal government actually has something in place called Plan to 2050. path to 2050, sorry. What that is, that's federal legislation that talks about the goals for the country to become 100% renewable by the year 2050. Now, some of you may have seen as well that there are goals by province that are a little more specific, some of which on even shorter timelines. So this allows you to not only lead the charge in making that leap to renewable, but also avoid the fines that will come from remaining on fossil fuels as the years pass toward those goals. Now, of course, sure, we can all agree cleaner air is nice. We're all concerned, of course, with greenhouse gas emissions from things like cars and idling and stuff like that. But a lot of us don't think about the fact of what happens with how we heat our house. Sure, it's easy enough to think about, well, if I have a gas furnace or an oil furnace, that's burning fossil fuels right there. But something that a lot of people don't think about is that, I'll use Nova Scotia as an example. Our electricity is only produced 43% by renewable resources, which means even if I heat with electricity, I'm still 57% chance burning fossil fuels at some point in the pipeline. So this allows us to take control of that and make a difference on the climate ourselves and have that independence. Now, a lot of people too come to me and they say, well, how do I know if it's going to be able to heat my house? It gets really cold. So one thing that we can do, for those of you that do choose to reach out to me after the fact, is I've actually prepared a spreadsheet. And this contains the historical weather data for every city in Canada, every major city with a weather station. So for example, we'll look at GTA, right? So taking let's just look at Sarnia. That's nice and easy. So you see we've got minimum temperature, -18, positive, and then we're able to figure out how efficient this heat pump's going to be in your climate. Our heat pumps are rated down to -30 degrees. So as you can see, using Ontario as an example, across the board, there's never a situation where it's offsetting less than 94% of your heating cost. Okay. These are very high efficiency, quite a long warranty on them, and often far supersede their warranty period and its lifespan. All right, so let's get back to gear. Lastly, of course, because a lot of us heat with different methods, different configurations are required. Some of us with oil, we may have ductwork. Some of us may have in-floor radiant and not have ductwork. We offer both ducted and ductless heat pumps to address all of these needs. So there's never a situation where if you are interested in going with heat pumps where it's not an option. So now let's look at heating with electricity. There's been a lot of buildup around this so far, right? So what we've got here is this includes electric baseboard, electric furnaces, electric radiators like in some older houses. And this is an average by province. Those of you who heat with oil may be kind of shocked to see this because for some of you, this is your entire power bill. But for those of you that heat with electricity, you see this and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of you are using 15, 20, 30,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year, or in other words, $300, $400, $500, $600 worth of electricity a month. And this kind of puts into perspective where some of that's coming from. So as you can see, of course, as many of you know, you're in Alberta and heating with electricity, it's not a very good choice, but that's why heat pumps come into play. And that brings us back to the whole 300% efficiency thing. In any case, no matter which province you're in, you're spending typically at least $95 a month on the heating portion of your bill. This is, of course, varying by the exact type of electric heat, as well as the square footage of your home, whether your close concept, how the insulation is, those sorts of things. So that brings me to another question I get a lot. If this is how much I'm spending on heating, shouldn't I upgrade the insulation? It never hurts to, but I've gotten energy audit reports from people before and after they've done insulation upgrades and replaced their windows and their doors. And What I see is approximately, at best, when comparing a 100-year-old house to a house that had just been upgraded to have all these green retrofits, a 40% decrease in heating costs. Let's say this is you here. We'll take something middle of the pack, Nova Scotia, $2,200 a year, $186 a month. 40% decrease, you're still paying well over $100 a month for heating that you don't need to be, because you can then switch to a heat pump, power that off the solar, get rid of it entirely. So whether you're in a home that's relatively new and considering this for that, or you're in an older home that you're doing upgrades to, it is always going to be substantially more affordable and substantially more sustainable to heat with heat pumps when powered by solar. So a little bit more detail on that. A lot of us that are heating with pretty much any heat source have some form of air conditioning. Now, I know some of you are coastal or you're on a bay or something like that, and you may just be able to open your windows and let the breeze come in. I wish I could say the same. I certainly don't like it being 35 degrees inside my apartment. But for those of you that are in that same situation where you need air conditioning in the summertime, that as well is going to contribute to your electricity costs. So in addition to these numbers that we're talking about, it's also important to consider how much you use AC at your house is also influencing your electricity bill. So with switching from electric heat and AC to heat pumps, again, there are some grants available. There are some municipal and provincial programs available too. If you have questions about that, again, we can definitely set up an appointment one-on-one. We can run through all the programs that you could qualify for. When it comes to the savings, though, just to kind of recap on that, you'll see that this average is now even higher. Electric heat is the least efficient form of heat when referring to things like baseboard. And this is because it's heating up a giant piece of metal and then relying on just physics and thermodynamics to distribute the heat. With heat pumps, because they have a heated element inside in the form of a coil that then distributes heat and cold through a mix of induction and convection, that is going to run about 300% the efficiency and save you approximately 70% of your heating cost. And that 30% that's left is then offset by the solar. Talking about the environmental benefits again, of course, as I mentioned, even here in Nova Scotia, heating with electric baseboard, I don't know where that electricity is coming from, because statistically, there's a 50-50 chance roughly that it's still coming from fossil fuels. You can change that. Talked about the power efficiency, cold climate, and the different configurations. So many of you who are using electric heat do not have ductwork in your house. For a closed concept house, this may mean that you want to head in each major room, or for an open concept house or a house that's relatively small, you may have just one or two per floor. We design these sorts of systems on a per person basis. There's no one size fits all for ductless, but that is usually what you're looking at when you're heating with electric heat. Those of you who have central for your air conditioning can use that ductwork typically though. So there may actually still be the option, if that's your situation, to do ducted. Neither is better than the other. That's why we offer both. Next, I want to talk about, and this is a bit different than what I talked to a lot of you about in our appointments, the cost of driving your car. I threw this in here because a lot of you have told me that you're looking at switching to an electric vehicle or to a hybrid. Okay, so I just recently got my first car, and it was a big shock realizing how much money I was spending on gas. It's so nice to think, well, I just want to go for a Sunday drive, until you realize this is what's coming out of your bank account. So that's why I want to show you this. Of course, whether you live urban or rural, this will make a difference on how much you drive on average, and how rural you live, of course, is going to make that difference too. But I've broken it out here by average based on province. As you can see, in some provinces where everything's a little bit more in cities, right? Everything is very close together. Some people are only driving 14,000 kilometers a year. Halifax, for example, everything is basically stacked on top of each other and shoulder to shoulder. So anybody who lives in the main city doesn't really need to drive much. Now, on the other hand, I grew up out on the East Coast in a place called Muscataugan Harbor, where everything is half an hour from everything else. So 22,000, actually, that far out, is pretty conservative. That's why we see with places like Saskatchewan that are known to be more spread out, we're looking at 27, 28,000. Now, looking at the average as of December 2025 cost of gas across the country, that was about $1.57 per liter. For some of you, it's more. For some of you, it's less. But this is based on the average. Urban, as you can see, almost everybody's spending over $2,000 a year. Rural, most people are spending well over $3,000 a year on gas. So that's another cost we can eliminate. Now, when you go with solar, doesn't mean you need to have an electric vehicle by any means. And it may be something you've thought about, but don't have a concrete timeline on. What a lot of people do is one of two things. One, they'll either get the electric vehicle charger installed by us at the time of solar install, so it's there. Or two, they may opt to get the extra panels needed. And we'll talk about how much that actually is required for electric vehicles here shortly. But the nice thing is that with our systems, they're scalable regardless. If you're thinking about getting an electric vehicle within the next 2 years, usually we like to include those panels too with the install of the system, just to get it all done at once, one set of permits, one site visit, all these sorts of things. Saves you some money in the long run. If you're thinking a hybrid, or you're thinking of something 5-10 years down the road, you may opt to have a halfway point, have a couple extra panels, and add the rest later. Depends on the person. We can help you decide that though. So in summary, as I said, $1.57 a liter, 15,000 to 24,000 kilometers per year. So based on average fuel efficiency, most cars get about 10 to 15 kilometers per liter of gas, which correlates to anywhere from $1,600 to $2,400 a year for urban drivers, or $2,500 to $3,800 for rural drivers. Now, of course, you guys know where you fall in that based on where you live and what kind of car you drive, but a lot of us don't take the time to zoom out beyond the, oh, it's the end of the week, I gotta go put $60 of gas in my car. If you're doing that every week, it certainly adds up quick, right? Now, where that can change is for those of you that are looking into electric vehicles and you don't know what that's going to look like in terms of savings. It can seem a bit ambiguous because electric vehicles are a bit more expensive than gas vehicles. So I'd like to kind of give you a little picture here of how that looks on average. So the average range for an electric vehicle is about 500 kilometers per charge with a 97.5 kilowatt hour battery. I have a table put together here too that I actually want to show you guys of what different models look like. Now, this isn't a fully exhaustive list, but it's just to give you an idea in case you're still shopping around. This is not me endorsing any specific brand to clarify as well, just to kind of give you some ideas of how your choice might look. So as you can see, everything here can be a small battery as little as 67, up to some vehicles now getting up to the 170, 200 kilowatt hour battery size. But what's important is how many kilometers, or how many kilowatt hours, sorry, per 10,000 kilometers. This is how, when I meet with you guys, I'm able to determine how many panels you need to offset your electricity for your electric vehicle. The average electric vehicle then, 97.5, 500 kilometers, corresponds to 1,953 kilowatt hours of electricity per 10,000 kilometers driven. So then we circle back to the presentation. Applying that to the average amount that people drive who are either living urban or rural. As you'll see then, for an urban driver, it's about 3,000 kilowatt hours a year on average to charge the vehicle. And for rural, we're looking at about 4,700. So to put that into perspective for you, because a lot of people think, well, it's going to add a lot to my cost. 3,000 kilowatt hours for many people is only 5 extra panels. 4,700 for many people, that might be more like 8. That's it. It's not as much of an expense as people think. So, as we had talked about there, pretty straightforward in terms of eliminating the cost. And it's always best to, if you're making the leap to an electric vehicle, to consider having the charger at home. If you're getting solar anyways, might as well have the independence of not having to drive to a charging station. And then lastly, what we'll talk about here today before we group it all together is batteries. So we talked briefly about batteries in the last presentation. I still wanted to kind of circle back again for those who missed it. There's a lot of kind of key points to batteries that save people money. As we talked about, there are net metering approaches and behind the meter. So quickly to recap on that, behind the meter means using the battery to save on your energy rates, peak shaving, arbitrage, not sending power back to the grid. Net metering is sending power back to the grid, getting your bill credits and taking the bill credits back at night. With the battery then, you have the option of using it for backup, for saving based on when you buy your power, or both. Places that don't have time of use. So Nova Scotia, we have one that's okay, but most people are on fixed rate. Ontario, you have an excellent time of use program. BC is pretty good too. You've got tiered. It can be very beneficial there too. But some other provinces like Newfoundland and Manitoba, your power is pretty consistent in cost. So usually when we look at batteries for that, the objective is backup. So for some of you, net metering might make more sense. For some of you, behind the meter might make more sense. And to solve that, that's usually one of my objectives when we meet, is to figure out what's going to be the best fit. But overall, the key points about batteries are many provinces have grants for these. In some provinces, it's a couple thousand. In some provinces like Ontario, it's up to 5,000 for the battery and up to 5,000 for the solar when you get them together. Now, circling back to those tiered rates and those time of use rates, depending on the province, depending on the rate plan, you may see that your rate for buying power overnight compared to the daytime can be as little as 19%, meaning that, let's say you're an average household. You use 60% of your power at night, 20% during what's called mid-peak times, and 20% during on-peak times. So that 20% of that usage, if you buy it all overnight with the battery and then discharge it during that time frame for the price that you paid for it, in some cases as little as 4 cents per kilowatt hour, that can correspond to a savings where you're paying, as we say here, as little as 19%. That's where that number comes from. Now, many of the batteries have a lot of advanced automation features too, to take all the stress out of all of it. Many of you who have generators know if you lose power because there's 6 feet of snow outside and your generator's outside and you have to go manually turn it on, the whole process is very uncomfortable, freezing cold, and can take several minutes for it to actually even come on. With something like the Tesla Powerwall, on the other hand, there's a 1-second transition or less from connected to the grid with power to fully off grid. So fast, in fact, you probably won't even see the clocks on your microwave reset. This is good too, because then you don't have to worry about losing work if you work from home, or maybe you're into video games, maybe you're watching a movie, whatever it is, right? Your life will remain uninterrupted. And furthermore, it'll actually predict the outages before they even happen. So Tesla app, for example, connects with environment data to receive potential brownout or blackout notifications so that it can make sure that the battery is charged. It will notify you of potential outages, which is really nice. Of course, the other thing too is with that behind the meter concept that we talked about, where you're buying that power cheaper, this corresponds on average for most people's household to about a 20% extra savings off their bill beyond what solar can do. So If you're, in the case of the example I showed you earlier, at about an 80% offset system, this is going to get you about 90, 95, coming up on 100% offset, because you're buying that extra power at that cheaper rate. As far as batteries go, it's not just Tesla. We have a whole bunch of different brands. We pick it based on not just your personal preferences, but what's actually going to be the best design for the house. Some people just want a small battery. Goal is just to have something for their fridge. Some people want whole home backup, and some people actually prefer to offset most of their bill, gamifying that time of use system by using batteries to buy all their power at discounted rate. Depends on the person, and that's something we like to figure out with you. Either way, regardless of how you go about it, it offers you a lot of independence in that you can have your rates be whatever you want by buying the power overnight or using it during the daytime for backup. There's endless options. And for those of you that are considering an electric vehicle, many of these batteries integrate seamlessly with electric vehicle charger apps, so you can see your whole systematic plans in one place. So lastly, looking at everything from one picture here. Obviously, what I'm talking to you guys about is transitioning everything to be in your control, powered by the solar, and with minimal reliance on or paying bills to your utility company, your gas company, these sorts of things. As I've mentioned in the beginning, not everybody will go with everything at once, but as you can see, this paints a picture for where you can get. Solar is the fundamental point. With solar, you're able to offset your electricity bill fully or partially, depending on your budget, and set yourself up for success for things like if you do choose to get an electric vehicle, if you do choose to save money on your heating and switching to heating that can be offset by your solar with heat pumps. And then you can further extend upon that with batteries to make sure that you're storing the power at your house, you have it for outages, or maybe you just want to play the game of the time of use system and save even more money that way. So that's everything I've got for you guys today. I'm going to open up the chat here for any Q&A that any of you might have come up with, and we'll answer what we can over the next 15 minutes or so. But for those of you who aren't sure where it's at, that is the little envelope button in the bottom right corner of your screen. I'll get that. Yes. Okay. So that's actually something I want to talk about a little bit. Can we do ground-based installs? Yes. So we do ground-mounted systems and we do roof-mounted systems. For everybody, it's a case-by-case basis, which is going to be the best fit, though. For some people who have really high usage, it may make sense to beeline it for ground mount. But for people who have low usage or a lot of available roof space, generally the preference is to do roof mount. The other factor is that having it ground mounted, it does mean that it needs special racking. It does mean it needs to be trenched back to the panel. And another common myth on that same note is about what happens to your roof. So when you put solar panels on your roof, a lot of people worry, is that going to damage my roof? What if I need to replace the shingles? As long as your roof is under 10 years old, there is no concern to putting them on there. In fact, solar panels roughly double the remaining lifespan on the roof shingles at the time they're installed. So let's say you have 25-year shingles, your roof is 10 years old. You add those panels on there, you've got 15 years left. Now you've got probably about 30 before the shingles need to be replaced. And why is that? Because the most common cause of damage to your roof are UV damage, water damage, hail damage, and wind damage. None of these things are coming in contact with your shingles. Now, of course, everybody has preferences in terms of placement or whatever it might be. So what we would do in your case there, Gord, is we would sit down with you and look over what your usage is, how the house looks, what condition it's in, and what your goals are. And we might compare the two options to figure out, is ground mount better, is roof mount better? And we can look at quotes for both and see what you think. So next here, want to know more about the grants. So the grants are going to depend on the province. In some provinces like Nova Scotia, we don't have any grants at present because every time they come out with grants, they get smaller and smaller, then they get rid of them. So there's none in here in Nova Scotia. But in contrast, we have places like Ontario, where we've got up to 5,000 for solar, 5,000 for batteries, some heat pump ones as well. One that's especially important for a lot of you, though, is a federal program called the Oil to Heat Pump Affordability Program. This can offer you up to 15,000 for heat pumps. So the point is, if you want to chat about grants, I'd love to show you what the options are. Let's set up an appointment for after the video call here, and I can run you through all your options for where you live. We have metal roof facing east and west. Is that a problem? No, absolutely not. So really, when it comes to solar, your best to worst goes as so. South is going to be the best exposure. West would be second best, east would be third, and north would be last. So if you have an east-west roof, typically the preference goes to putting the panels on the west, and then if more are needed, to put them on the east. But what we would do is when we're looking at the system and your needs, we would see, is enough of the system going to fit on the west side to just use that? Are we going to have to use some of the east side, or is it better to just do ground mount? So that's something that we would figure out together and weigh the pros and cons of each, and then come up with a good action plan for that going forward. Any opportunities for solar shingles? That's actually a question I get a lot. Solar shingles are on the market, mostly in the States. The problem is that solar, regardless of whether it's panels or shingles, there's not a lot of variance in terms of the actual power production. So let's say, for example, for simplicity, you've got a rectangular house, rectangular roof. You pack that entire thing with the panels we use. Maybe that'll produce 10 kilowatts of power and cost you, let's say, $30,000. You go with solar shingles and you plaster the entire roof in solar shingles, you will probably get about the same output when comparing apples to apples square footage coverage, but it will probably cost you 50 to 60,000, and there's a shorter lifespan on a lot of these solar shingles because they're newer equipment, right? So it isn't something on the Canadian market right now, and in most cases, in the States where it's sold, it ends up costing substantially more in the long run anyways, for actually no performance boost. Does house insurance, this is a good question, actually. This is a really good one. Does house insurance increase with the cost, increasing cost with roof mounted panels? Let me show you. So any feedback from you guys on this when we meet is absolutely excellent. But what I do is I actually keep a spreadsheet of all of the different insurance companies I've spoken to so far. And this will kind of answer all of you at once on this, I suppose. So, as we can see here, there are 13 or so different companies I've spoken to. It depends on the company. Again, not incentivized or connected with TD personally, but TD is what a lot of our clients are with for home insurance because of the fact that they cover the panels with their basic coverage. And as of right now, there's no increase to premiums. On the other hand, the only company I've run into so far that doesn't is Intact. And most of the companies that do offer increases in premiums but cover the solar, you'll notice that the cost is somewhere $40 a year, $50 a year, $100 a year. The most I've ever seen it be was $10 a month. So even if there is an increase, it's very minimal when it does happen. Something you can very easily get information on from your policy documents, where you should have received those when you signed up, and if not, call your insurance advisor and they can talk to you about what kind of coverage you have on your existing insurance. Let's see. Add the solar shingle question. Is this how the solar? Yeah. So Chris already answered this. The solar shingles aren't available in Canada, and that we do, have solar panels, of course, in Canada, but it's not something that, like I said, is super incentivized for people to buy. The demand for solar shingles here in Canada is so low that it's hard to say if they'll ever come here because of that cost that's associated and the shorter lifespan that can kind of come with it. Okay, let's see if I missed anything else here. Can you work with an existing gym? Right question. Okay. So clarify me in the chat if I'm wrong, Gord. I just want to make sure I understand the question correctly. Can you work with an existing geothermal heat pump? So you mean to replace it with a new heat pump, or do you mean powering it with solar? Because if it's powering it with solar, the nice thing about solar panels, you can power anything in your house. Doesn't matter if it's heating or your television or whatever. So yes, definitely could. If your question is about getting different heat pumps that are air to air, that's an option too. But solar is supplemental, I would say. I'll use it. Yeah, okay. So if you're heating with geothermal, you can continue to do that, and then you could use the solar panels to power the geothermal system, same as you would power pretty much any other option that you have for electricity, for whatever. Someone is heating with electric baseboards and driving an electric vehicle. How much could they save per year? How fast would they get that back? Well, so that's going to depend on you. But if you're heating with electricity, varies quite a bit across the country. We take the average, right? Nova Scotia is pretty central in terms of the pricing. So $2,232 a year. With solar, and especially if you go with heat pumps, you can get rid of all of that, right? And then the solar will produce enough electricity for all of it. 10 to 14,000 kilowatts. That's 16 to 20 panels. So, and for most people that are heating with electricity here on the East Coast, this is 90% of their bill anyways, is their heating cost. So effectively, as you can see, depending on the place, $1,000 to $4,000 a year, dependent on your actual consumption. And part two of that question was about the driving electric vehicle. Yeah. So circling back to with the electric vehicle, then comes down to the amount of kilometers you drive based on averages. The average person is spending $1,600 to $2,400 a year on gas for urban, and then $2,500 to $3,800 for rural. If you're on an electric vehicle and you're driving a similar amount, that is 3,000 to 4,700 kilowatt hours of electricity. So depending on your province, that's going to work out to about $50-$60 a month. Okay? So that would be eliminated with the solar too. Putting that together then, between heating with electricity and an electric vehicle, you could, great time for hiccups. You could save well over $200 a month. It's going to depend on you. I'd love to sit down though and have an appointment and see what your specific usage looks like. Yes, energy audits between 6 and 800. Yes. So yeah, I have been asked about this before as well. So with energy audits, that was a thing for previous programs of the government before, and it's just hoops to jump through is what they did. But it's not necessary almost anywhere in Canada at this point. The only case in which people get energy audits is if they have absolutely no clue why their usage is so high, using 60,000 kilowatt hours and can't figure out what they need to be turning off, but not really necessary. No, nothing to worry about there. Just making sure I didn't miss anything here. Oh, yes. Okay. Actually, one other thing I wanted to add actually to your question, John, about insurance is when you had asked about storm damage. So home insurance does cover what's called acts of God or nature, storm, stuff like that, outages, falling damage, like trees falling on your house. That's what would be covered by your home insurance company. So none of that would be an issue. going to keep this going for about 5 more minutes. So if you guys have any other questions, pop them in the chat for me. Okay, so Saskatchewan rebates. So if you're in Saskatoon, there's something called the HELP program, which does offer up to $4,000 for roof-mounted solar. If you're somebody who has First Nation status, like Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, they offer up to $15,000 for solar panels and $12,000 to $15,000 for heat pump upgrades and stuff like that. And then, of course, there's also the oil to heat pump affordability program, which we talked about before. It is income dependent, but again, we can look at the eligibility of that for you together if you'd like. Is there such a system as a ductless geothermal heat pump? To be honest with you, Paul, I'm not entirely sure. Most of the time with a ductless system, it works with just the single unit and then distributes it through the ductwork. As far as zoned, some people opt to go with mini splits for that. They have to make these upgrades for 100%. Of course. So as far as financing options go, we actually have a lot of different things. We have our in-house, we're partnered with a company called FinSense. They're a third-party brokerage. So what happens is that if you were to need some help with financing, and we've decided on a project that you're interested in after narrowing down some options, we connect you with our gentleman named Chris over at FinSense, not the Chris that's in the chat with you guys, to clarify. And he would take you through a bunch of different options. There would only be one credit application, and he can look at 80 to 90 different creditors with you. He's shopping around for you for the lowest rates. So for those of you who have car insurance, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. You go to your bank and they'll quote you, and sometimes they'll tell you get like a rebate for having your banking with them. But then if you go to a brokerage and you take a look, guaranteed they found something cheaper than your bank. It's the same thing with this. Okay, now, as far as other financing options, there are different municipal and provincial programs available as well. So some of these are things like the HUM loan, or Toronto Hydro has a loan program. There's a couple of municipalities in Nova Scotia that have their own programs as well. So as far as the alternative financing options, those are things that we look at once we're at a point where our financing doesn't work. The financing that we offer is relatively easy to access, though. Okay, so the main criteria being having at least 20% equity in your home. So it is a home equity line of credit. The interest rates are competitive, but they are dependent on your credit score. Okay, so what we see is an average of about 4.7%, but it's going to depend on things like your credit score, your debt to income ratio, and the actual amount of equity in the home, things like that. Though, as far as getting the exact payments and interest rates and stuff like that, what we do is start with designing a system, see what that would look like for you, and then we could explore some options from there. Okay. Don't think I've missed anything. So Leo says you have to go with a certified company to do the work in order to qualify for the grants. So whatever is required by the specific program you're looking into, whether it's provincial or federal or whatever, we always make sure that you get that money. So we are on the list for pretty much every sort of program that's there. But in the event that we're not explicitly listed, we will find a solution where we can still help you with getting that program. So nothing to worry about there. That's most often the case, though, for very rural areas. So you have like a municipal incentive, for example, and it's somewhere in the boonies, as they say, then That's usually where it becomes us looking into a way that we can get it for you. Yes. So another program that, as Chris was talking about here, yeah. So there's another program called the TFFI, which is an unsecured loan. It can be done over 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and it's up to 9.99%. So whether you go with TFFI or our in-house financing or whatever you choose to do, you can actually, when your mortgage comes up for renewal, transfer that to be included in your mortgage so that you have just the one payment, but it allows you to get a head start on getting the solar done. And the reason that that's something that you'd want to do rather than just waiting for when your mortgage renews, let's say it's in a year and a half or 2 years, is I've been here for a year and a half, and the cost of solar across the market has gone up about 20%, and it's not slowing down. So I've seen quotes from any company you can think of in Canada for solar, and it's across the board. So the idea is essentially we start you with solar. If you need financing help in the interim, that's okay. We get you that, whether it's TFFI or FinSense or finance it or whatever. And then as soon as your financing is dispersed and everything's taken care of and you're making your payments on it, if you decide when your mortgage comes up they'd like to lump it in with that, that's an option too. Lifespan of the panels. So something I want to clarify about that actually is the warranty is 25 years, but the performance guarantee, as it's called, is 30 years. So the distinction there is that with the panels that we use, which are a Longi brand 500-watt panels, they guarantee a performance of over 87% compared to day one efficiency 30 years after purchase. So these are the longest lasting or longest warranty panels on the market. And then beyond that are expected to last a total of 15 to 20 years more. So up to 40 to 50 years for the panels in total before they need to be replaced. All right, so we are at 7:30 here, or sorry, 6:30 Eastern. So I'm gonna wrap it up here now. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put my contact information here in the chat, and I'll also have an email go out after we're done this, which will also have my contact information. If you guys are looking for some one-on-one information, some of you had some questions that I'd like to be able to give a little more customized advice to than just general nationwide advice like incentives and roof mount versus ground mount, book into my calendar. I'm booking for next week right now from about Tuesday to, yeah, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. It's kind of my most availability for next week. But book a time in, I'll give you a call, get some more information about what you're looking to do, and then we will put something together and see what you think. But in any case, thank you guys very much for your time this evening. And, we also have, as promised, the exclusive discount code for everybody who attended. So I'm going to paste that into the chat. And I think we can probably put that out potentially. But that's your promotion code right there, guys. So just copy that down. Just thank you guys again, and we will see you next time. Bye for now.